If you're a business with a strong connection to history, education, travel, or place based storytelling, and you're looking to reach an audience that values those things, we should talk. You can reach me at john.summers@summersmediaenterprises.com. Now, let's get back to our story. Welcome to the Tennessee History Nerd. This is a podcast dedicated to Tennessee's past. Every week we bring you a new story about the people, places, and events that have shaped Tennessee and made it, and us, who and what we are. So grab your favorite beverage, find a comfortable place, and sit back and enjoy. After the Civil War, men who had been fully and conscientiously intent upon killing each other now were countrymen again and had to try to learn to live peaceably with one another. In some places, they failed. In the places where they succeeded, it wasn't an easy thing. It's difficult to accept your sworn enemy as your friend simply because a white flag was waved and a surrender was signed. After the war, the lost cause narrative became one of the means of justifying things and healing the wounds. The war was over states' rights from the Southern perspective. The two sides recognized each other as hard-fighting soldiers who fought what they believed in, and the soldiers of both sides have fought bravely and honorably. In many cases, to one degree or another, it was true, but in others it wasn't. And the important thing is that this spin, this narrative, enabled the country to heal, for the soldiers on both sides to reconcile. And it took a long time for many. For some, the wounds never healed and the bitterness never softened. In some cases, the bitterness was hereditary. In others, the fading of one generation into the next provided the basis for the reconciliation of the second or third generation, even if the first wasn't ever able or willing to do so. Today, you'll find those who absolutely believe that those who fought for the South were all slavery supporters and that every man who wore the Confederate uniform was a traitor to his country. You'll also find those who believe that anyone who ever marched with Sherman or Grant or any Union army operating in the South was an oppressor and an illegal invader. The vast majority is somewhere in the middle. But this story isn't about the Civil War. I say all of this to say that I think that the after effect for the 1946 Battle of Athens, Tennessee, is very similar. There's no doubt there was an armed rebellion against the existing local governmental structure. There's no doubt that the veterans who were involved broke the law. One even said something to the effect of, "Yes, we broke the law. So did George Washington." There's no doubt that they acted in a way that could have resulted in deaths. And so they are perhaps guilty at least of reckless endangerment. And certainly government property was damaged and destroyed. At the same time, there's little doubt that what they were fighting back against was an entrenched political machine that had far more interest in ensuring that its people stayed in power than in fair elections. And there also been a great deal of corruption, of law enforcement brutality, which had resulted in multiple deaths, and questionable accounting practices with department budgets. 80 years later, while most of those who participated on one side or the other are all dead, or at least in very advanced years, most of their children are still alive and their grandchildren. And everyone naturally wants to ensure that daddy or grandpa is remembered favorably. And so naturally, narratives are often filled with spin. Positive memories are enhanced. Unfavorable memories are repressed. What eventually comes to be remembered may be as much legend as it is factual history in many cases. And so, sometimes digging through the spin to get to the real events can be challenging. Again, much like it often has been with Civil War events. The part that most people know about the Battle of Athens is the climax, when everything finally came to a head, but like a lot of other momentous events, there's a lot more to the story. A whole lot of buildup that finally erupted in the battle on the night of August 1st, 1946. In other words, the battle wasn't tied to one day of election chicanery. It was the culmination of years of problems. One of those problems was tied to the concept of what were informally known as Ripper Bills. The name originated in the late 19th century, particularly in Pennsylvania, where legislatures would pass laws that ripped authority away from locally elected officials and assigned it to officials appointed by or controlled by the state government. Although the Tennessee Constitution of 1870 allowed for this kind of tactic, it didn't become nearly as big of an issue until the early 20th century. We'll get more into that shortly. On the topic of these Ripper Bills, the legislature in Tennessee, which is called the General Assembly, would pass what are called private acts. These acts are very specific. They deal with a specific location, such as McMinn County or even Athens, and they often deal specifically even with a particular office in McMinn County. And the same thing was happening also with other counties across the state. And to be clear, there are often legitimate needs for private acts. Counties actually request those all the time from the legislature, even now. So not all private acts are Ripper Bills, that is, legislative acts that take away decisions reached through local elections. However, when you look at the history of those kinds of actions, there are 154 distinct enactments affecting McMinn County from 1871 through 1953. Of those, 126 are officially or formally called private acts. 26 are simply acts, earlier measures that aren't formally called private acts, but probably are of the same basic structure, and 2 that are public acts, but which specifically impact McMinn County. Of those 154 distinct enactments of that 82-year period, the period of 1931 to 1935 alone produced 42 distinct enactments. Over a quarter, 27% of those came in that one 5-year period. What did those bills deal with? Well, it dealt with sheriff and deputy salaries, jury commissions, court organization, tax collection, road commissioners and supervisors, school administration, county attorneys, budgets and purchasing, elected and appointed offices, salaries, tenure, and methods of selection. This corresponds with the rise of Tennessee machine politics, like the Crump machine. Now, let me be fair here. Correlation does not prove causation, but it does give reason to look closely at what was happening. And one thing that happened was that in 1941, there was a change in the number of voter precincts in McMinn County. 1941 McMinn County was quite rural. It still is to a large extent, but then it was even more so. And fewer people had cars. There are fewer paved roads. There was no I-75 running through a short distance away. So the bill changing the number of precincts, ostensibly to make it more readily administered, fewer precincts equals fewer poll workers required, easier ballot box collection, etc. But it also made it more difficult for people in far rural areas to get to the voting precinct. And it made it easier to engage in questionable activity. Another previous bill had changed the voting districts, realigning the districts to make them less Republican. This, of course, still happens today. It's called gerrymandering, and even right now, there's a hue and cry over the gerrymandering that's going on. But in the private acts of 1941, George Wood, the McMinn County representative in the General Assembly, introduced the act that reduced the number of precincts. He also reduced the number of justices of the peace and the control of the county court, what was then the term for the county legislative body. It's a rather confusing way of referring to it, given that it uses the same term that would be expected for the judicial branch. But anyway, what all this did was to create a situation where election manipulation was easier. And what makes all this possible was the fact that a political machine was in power. By the period we're talking about, the Crump machine out of Memphis was in full swing. It may sound odd that a political machine in Memphis would have so much sway in all of Tennessee, especially in East Tennessee. Certainly sounded strange at first to me. But the fact is, once the influence of the Memphis machine gains significant enough foothold at the state level in Nashville, it was then able to exert influence across the entire state. And more local machines, like the Cantrell-Mansfield machine, were able to align with and coordinate with Crump in ways that proved to be mutually beneficial. By way of clarification, it probably is appropriate that we take a moment to talk about the machine in McMinn County and note who Cantrell and Mansfield were. Paul Cantrell was the sheriff of McMinn County and was later a state senator. He was also chairman of the McMinn County Court, that is the county legislative body, and was chairman of the McMinn County Democratic Party. If your idea of a good weekend includes a fishing rod, a boat, a campsite, and a Tennessee sunset over the water, then you need to check out Birdsong Resort, Marina, and Campground. Located on scenic Kentucky Lake on the beautiful Tennessee River, just 9 miles off Interstate 40 at exit 133, Birdsong is conveniently located halfway between Memphis and Nashville. Family owned and welcoming guests since 1961, Birdsong is now operated by the second generation of the Keast family, and whether you're looking for cabins, full-service RV sites, primitive tent camping, boat rentals, boat sales, fuel, bait, or easy lake access, Birdsong has you covered. Be sure to visit the Tennessee River Freshwater Pearl Museum, where you'll find Tennessee's official state gem, the freshwater pearl, and learn how the freshwater pearl industry brought worldwide attention to this part of Tennessee. To start planning your getaway, visit birdsong.com or call 731-584-7880. That's birdsong.com or call 731-584-7880. Birdsong Resort, Marina, and Campground. I think you'll be glad you went. And when you call, tell them Big John sent you. Paul Mansfield was the chief deputy sheriff under Cantrell and then was himself later sheriff when Cantrell became state senator. It was at this point, when these private acts were enacted, that previously Republican strongholds began to see significant inroads from the Democrats. Again, coincidence doesn't necessarily indicate causation. And without solid evidence of the fact, I hesitate to say that one was caused by the other, but it nevertheless is definitely worthy of consideration. And frankly, it does have the appearance of correlation between the two. Another issue that was without a doubt a contributing factor in the events leading to the Battle of Athens was fee grabbing. Fee grabbing was a way of making money by making arrests. Sheriffs and deputies were paid a fee for serving warrants, for making arrests, for transporting prisoners, and performing other official duties. The more arrests they made, the more money they earned. The temptation, of course, was to arrest people who hadn't really done anything serious or to pile on extra charges simply because every arrest put more money in their pockets. Fee grabbing was, in essence, policing for profit. Instead of law enforcement officers being paid a regular salary, sheriffs and deputies got paid fees for doing law enforcement work, and that meant every arrest was another payday. Honest officers enforced the law. Crooked officers started looking for people to arrest because it made them money. In McMinn County, the problem went beyond simply making unnecessary arrests. State law limited what the sheriff and his deputies were supposed to keep. The rest was supposed to go into the county treasury. But per Tyler Boyd, McMinn County archivist and president of the local historical society, auditors later concluded that the sheriff's department administration inflated office expenses so that they could keep far more of that money than the law intended. According to Chris DeRose in The Fighting Bunch, the McMinn County civics teacher at the time, Fred Pruitt, explained it to his students this way, quote, "The sheriff runs the jail as his private business. He hires a jailer and a cook out of his fees. He buys the food. It is a good business if the jail is kept full. The justices of the peace who form the governing board of the county court, are also paid in fees. The result is that the justices cooperate in keeping the jail full. The standard fine for minor offenses, drunkenness, traffic violations, and simple assault, after the violator has been jailed by the arresting officer is $16.05. This breaks down as follows: $6 to the arresting officer, $4.55 to the justice of the peace, $1 turnkey charge for letting the man in the jail, and $1 for letting him out, $1.50 for 2 days' meals at 75 cents a day, and $2 for the county. Especially profitable are drunks arrested after supper and let out before breakfast. As every lawyer would agree, that means the prisoner spends 2 legal days in the jail, and the sheriff is entitled to $1.50 for feeding him. Why does the officer get $6? $2 for serving a warrant, $2 for hauling the prisoner to jail if the distance is more than 6 miles, $2 for subpoenaing 4 witnesses at 50 cents a witness. Of course, the arresting officer does none of these things. He does not serve a warrant, and he summons no witnesses, and there's often no haulage. He may make the arrest a block from jail, but it has become established that the officer gets $6 for every arrest. 10 arrests on a Saturday night, $60 is good business for a deputy sheriff, end quote. To put that in context, $60 in 1938 would be worth just over $1,400 in 2026, according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Price Index. $1,400 in a single shift would equate to about $175 an hour on an 8-hour shift. That's quite a haul even today. People passing through the area, even on the bus, might be arrested for a charge like public drunkenness. No breathalyzer in those days. No readily available blood test. Just the officer's word against the defendant, whose word matters in that situation. And it was either pay the fine or spend the night in jail. During World War II, servicemen passing through the county were particularly easy marks for this type of scheme. Those were men who were on their way to their next duty station. They had to report in on time. They couldn't afford to be late and listed as AWOL, absent without leave. And so even though the fine was more than they could easily be able to afford, they had to pay the fine or risk a much worse outcome from the military. But it also went beyond fee grabbing. What happened if someone resisted being taken advantage of in this way? Well, the administration and staff didn't like interference in their program. And so there was also another aspect of the administration that was, unfortunately, a carryover perhaps from previous administrations: police brutality. One of the pushbacks sometimes when brutality is mentioned in the context of the Cantrell-Mansfield sheriff administrations is that brutality didn't start when those men took office. One counter to that is that it evidently didn't stop with them either. And it was when it was used in conjunction with fee grabbing that made it so pervasive. And with the number of justices of the peace significantly reduced, there were fewer opportunities for a speedy trial. And a strange practice to us nowadays, but which was not uncommon in Tennessee in the first half of the 20th century, is that just about any private citizen could be deputized at any time. No proof of qualifications was required. One did not have to have law enforcement training or experience. One did not have to prove suitability for the role. It didn't even have to be the sheriff doing the deputizing. A deputy could also deputize a private citizen. One such set of circumstances occurred in September 1944. According to the account in The Fighting Bunch by Chris DeRose, a local young man named Earl Ford was home on leave from the Navy after almost a year and a half away. He went out to listen to some music and have a drink and was accompanied by another sailor by the name of Luke Miller. At the bar where he had gone, a place called the Halfway Court, located about 2 miles out of Athens going toward Sweetwater, Ford requested the use of the phone. And although the phone was in plain sight, he was told they didn't have one. So the 2 men got up to leave. Deputy Menace Wilburn saw the 2 men leave and assumed they were easy marks as servicemen home on leave, because those types of men typically had money. He'd arrest them and pocket the fee. He deputized 2 known criminals, George Sperling and Clyde Davis, to help him to arrest the two men. Sperling repeatedly bludgeoned Ford over the head. Ford attempted to surrender, holding his hands in the air, but Sperling shot him in the chest. Ford staggered and tried to remain standing, but ultimately fell to the ground where he was left to lie for 20 minutes. He was taken to the local Forey hospital, where he was pronounced dead. The next day, Sheriff Mansfield defended the shooting in the local newspaper as justified, stating that Wilburn had undertook to subdue a bunch of disorderly sailors and others and deputized Sperling and others on the scene to help him. Per Mansfield's account, Ford had been pulled off Sperling's back, and he had charged Sperling with a knife. The knife had, per Wilburn, been found underneath Ford's body. Witnesses to the event hadn't seen a knife and stated that Ford never did offer threat or resistance to Sperling. Ford was in his Navy uniform, which had no pockets. Not saying it was impossible for him to have been carrying a knife, but it was certainly more difficult to conceal one with no pockets. His funeral in Decatur, in neighboring Meigs County, was reportedly one of the largest crowds ever to assemble in Decatur, and his epitaph said, quote, "Killed in the service of his country in Athens, Tennessee," end quote. Naturally, Ford's family pushed for Sperling's prosecution. Luke Miller, Ford's companion, had been blackjacked by Milburn and was in the hospital and recovering. A statement made by the sheriff's office to the local newspaper indicated that he would be arrested for resisting arrest upon his release. Sperling was being protected by the Mansfield administration. His trial would be a seemingly endless series of continuances. This is but one such set of circumstances. Early in Cantrell's term as sheriff, a young man by the name of Carl Voiles had been killed in his home when 3 deputies burst into the house and shot him. Allegedly, they were following through on a fight Carl possibly had been involved in. His death left a wife behind. When the Voiles family pushed for charges to be filed against Oliver Nichols, the deputy who had shot Voiles, Judge Sue Hicks dismissed the case. As an aside, Judge Sue Hicks, a man, was the inspiration for Shel Silverstein to write the Johnny Cash hit, A Boy Named Sue. Anyway, less than a year later, a man named Hub Johnson, who had a paper route with his kids, was also a victim of this type of violence. His wife had died suddenly, and he and his kids worked the route together to make enough to live on. Johnson was by this point in his 60s and evidently had frequent urinary issues. One day, while in the middle of a route, he needed to relieve himself and chose to do so behind a convenient billboard. Oliver Nichols, the same deputy who was behind the death of Carl Voiles, saw Johnson and repeatedly struck him with a blackjack in front of his kids, killing him. Nichols accused Johnson of resisting arrest and striking him first. Again, the case was dismissed by Judge Hicks without ever going to trial. So there was no question that there was abuse going on. There was no question that the system was weighted in favor of those who held the power. And the machine's methods were designed such that whoever held the power was almost assured of holding on to it. If you enjoy the stories we tell each week and would like to show your support, I'd like to invite you to check out the Summers Media Enterprises merchandise store. You'll find shirts, hats, mugs, stickers, and other items featuring both the Tennessee History Nerd and Dauphin Island Diaries. This month's featured item is one of my personal favorites, our I Break for Historical Markers bumper stickers. Whether you're the kind of person who can't drive past a historical marker without pulling over, or you simply appreciate a good piece of history, it's a fun way to let everyone know you're always on the lookout for the next great story. To browse the entire collection, just visit the link in the show notes or visit the Summers Media Enterprises website. Every purchase helps to support the work that goes into researching, producing, and sharing these stories each week. Thanks for listening. Thanks for supporting our podcasts, And now let's get back into the story. By the time World War II finally came to an end and the McMinn County veterans all returned home, many no longer were going to be satisfied with the status quo. These were men who'd grown up during the growth of the political machine, but had then gone off to fight in a war that, like the First World War, was sometimes noted as having been fought to, quote, make the world safe for democracy, end quote. And then they came home to a system in which democracy was perceived as being thwarted. They were able to secure the basement of the Robert E. Lee Hotel, which was located on the corner of Jackson and Madison, right across from the McMinn County Courthouse. This provided a safe place for them to have their beer and liquor without being harassed, or worse, by the deputies of Cantrell-Mansfield. It became the home of the VFW. In March of 1946, Paul Cantrell announced that he was going to run for sheriff again and that Pat Mansfield would run for his old state Senate seat. At that point, the veterans began to collaborate on how they could produce a ticket to fight the Cantrell-Mansfield machine. They did so in secret, realizing that anyone who chose to fight the machine was subject to a host of issues. They were finally ready to make the ticket public knowledge in May of 1946. An ad run in the local Post-Athenian newspaper called for all former military men and women, regardless of creed or color, to attend a GI mass meeting at the courthouse on Thursday, May 9, 1946. The objective was to nominate candidates for office. The ad admonished, if you are interested in cleaning up McMinn County and the return of good, clean, honest, efficient government, don't fail to attend. Over 300 veterans attended and provided proof of military service for entry. The movement was intended to be nonpartisan. When nominations began to be taken for various offices, some of the potential candidates had declined due to the high risk involved, but ultimately the ticket was Knox Henry for sheriff, Frank Carmichael for county trustee, treasurer, and tax assessor, Bill Hamby for circuit court clerk, George Painter for county clerk, and Charlie Pickle for register of deeds. All of these men had served during the war, and these men were accustomed to functioning by maps and according to missions, and began working the county in a political campaign with the same kind of focus and purpose that they might have applied to military campaigns just a few years earlier. The message they presented, regardless of how it was shared, was, vote GI, your vote will be counted as cast. In the final weeks before the election, the machine turned up the heat on the GI candidates. Threatening phone calls were made in the middle of the night to GI supporters. Supporters putting up campaign signs were harassed by deputies, or worse. Some were even clubbed in the street. Signs were stolen and destroyed. A statement in the July 19, 1946 Nashville, Tennessee newspaper said, quote, the machine in McMinn County, which usually controls elections in adjoining counties, has gained a reputation for being tough, end quote. At an all-GI meeting called to discuss the dirty tactics of the opposition, Marine Corps veteran Bill White asked the candidates, do you think they're going to let you win this election? White resolved to organize a fighting bunch. At the time of this election, voters in Tennessee were still required to pay a poll tax. At the time, the state of Tennessee exempted former servicemen who had served at least 30 days in 1945 from having to pay the poll tax in 1946. A serviceman simply had to verify their service with the trustee's office, who would document their name in a book and would issue them a receipt they would turn in with their ballot. When the veterans went to get their receipt, the trustee told them he didn't have the book. It was in nearby Etowah. When they tried going to Etowah, no book there either. When the trustee finally had the book, his deputy wrote, erased, and rewrote names, something that would cause issues on Election Day. And the receipts had to be purchased on or before June 3rd. And then the real challenge wasn't actually acquiring the poll tax receipts, it was keeping them. Veterans were being arrested without cause, and then their receipts were confiscated and not returned. And yet, in spite of these challenges, the GI slate of candidates campaigned hard. The machine candidates, almost none. And yet the machine candidates remained quite confident of winning. It was becoming apparent that they weren't planning on winning by earning the most votes through convincing the voters. August 1st, 1946, the day of the election, finally arrived. And the morning, well before the polls opened for business at 9 a.m., started in an unusual way. The old Tellico train arrived. Usually, for most days, a handful of people would normally get off the train. On this day, it was estimated that more than 30 showed up. A veritable parade of out-of-county and out-of-state cars drove into town throughout the morning. All the passengers wore badges. All were armed. Chuck Redfern, the first broadcaster on the new WLAR radio station in Athens, arrived at the station to find 3 armed deputies awaiting him. Estimates were that Mansfield had at least 250 armed men in McMinn County. The county was de facto, if not de jure, under martial law for Election Day. Bud Evans, GI poll watcher for Precinct 3 in Etowah, was arrested simply for asking to see the ballot box to ensure that it was empty before the votes began being cast. Deputies were in the polls and hovering over voters, actually watching them cast their votes and doing their best to intimidate voters. Urgent telegrams were being sent to the Attorney General appealing for protection for the voters of McMinn County. The poll watcher in the courthouse precinct, Walter Ellis, protested every time someone was not on the list but was permitted to vote. Deputy Frank Walker had him arrested. When one of the GI committee members, Jim Buttram, attempted to post his bail, he was refused. Felix Herod replaced Ellis as poll watcher, but was as helpless as Ellis to do anything about the irregularities being permitted. At the GI Executive Committee headquarters, an election fraud hotline had been established. The plan had been that if anyone saw fraudulent activity going on, they could call that line and report it. It was ringing off the hook. The plans that the committee had put in place had underestimated the lengths that the machine would go to. They had no intention of losing, and the committee's measures were being systematically overwhelmed by Pat Mansfield's army. About 3 p.m., Tom Gillespie, an aging African-American farmer, rode his horse to town to vote. His grandparents hadn't enjoyed the right to vote. He conscientiously ensured that he observed having access to that right. He always voted. He arrived at the Waterworks precinct on Jackson Street and marked his ballot for the candidates on the GI ticket. Deputy Wendy Wise blocked him from placing his vote in the ballot box. After an exchange in which the deputy used a racial epithet to describe Gillespie, Wise punched Gillespie. He was wearing brass knuckles. He then shoved Gillespie out the door onto the sidewalk. Gillespie stood back up, walked back inside the polling place, and folded his arms and leaned against the wall. Wise cursed him and then pulled out his pistol and shot Gillespie. Gillespie was dragged from the poll, first to the jail and then to the hospital. At the Dixie Cafe precinct about 3:15 p.m., when a man showed up without a poll tax receipt and Menace Wilburn accepted it, Bob Harrell, the GI election judge there, protested. Wilburn cursed him, drew his club, and struck Harrell over the head with it again and again until he fell to the floor. Once he was down, Wilburn began kicking him in the face and continuing to beat on him. The GI poll watcher for that precinct was a one-armed man named Les Dooley. Dooley was in no condition to fight back and sounded the alarm would serve to get someone else killed or injured. Harrell was beaten into unconsciousness. Thankfully, Wilburn's gun had snagged in its holster as he was trying to draw it, or he might have gone ahead and killed Harrell. As it was, Harrell was bleeding and unconscious and was dragged to the jail. Somehow, Dr. Forey heard about Harold's situation and went to the jail. Deputies told him to leave, but Forey refused and took Harold back to his hospital. One of the deputies had stolen Harold's wallet. All his money and the pictures of his baby that he'd carried with him across Europe during the war were in the wallet. Deputy Menace Wilburn closed the Dixie Cafe precinct early, blocked the door with 2x4s, and opened the ballot box and began counting the ballots. Dooley was forced into a back room in the cafe. At 4 p.m., all the polls closed. Votes began to be counted. In some precincts, armed men arrived and handed the election officer packets of marked ballots. In most cases, the GI poll watchers were being forced to stay, but were not being permitted actually to observe closely. Shy Scott and Ed Vestall, the GI observers in the Waterworks precinct, had to make a dramatic escape by crashing through a glass door after two newspapermen arrived outside. They then got up and walked away with their hands held high over their heads, sure that they were about to be shot in the back, and they nearly were. Wendy Wise, who earlier had shot Tom Gillespie, aimed his pistol at the back of Shy Scott. Deputy George Sperling, who previously killed Earl Ford, also pointed his pistol at the GIs. Another deputy dissuaded them from shooting the GIs in the back, and they melted into the crowd. If you enjoy the way we tell stories here on the Tennessee History Nerd, there's another show you might want to check out, Dauphin Island Diaries. Same approach, different setting. Stories from the Gulf Coast, rooted in place and built from the sources up. You can find it wherever you're listening right now. And now, back to our story. Just after 5 p.m., the deputies formed two rows in front of the Waterworks precinct, in front of Sheriff Mansfield's car as he arrived. Mansfield walked into the precinct, retrieved the ballot box, and then left with it. He claimed that he was moving the box to a safe space. A reporter shooting pictures of the departing sheriff was swarmed by deputies. They destroyed the film in his camera and arrested him. No legitimate charge was provided. "We'll think of something," he was told. At the S&K garage, where several of the GIs had gathered, two of the deputies decided to make a call. That was a mistake. Even though the deputies drew their firearms, they were beset by a large crowd and quickly disarmed, tied up, and thrown on a coal pile inside the garage. As the GIs resumed their meeting, a lookout shouted that more deputies were on the way. Again, it was only two that had come looking for their colleagues, and they were quickly overcome as well. The machine then sent 4 more deputies. 3 of them also were captured as well, and the GIs decided to take them out of town. They forced them to strip, and then they were tied to trees and left there. The GIs returned to the S&K garage. At this point, it was looking like all was lost as far as the election was concerned. The GI Executive Committee had made a decision early on not to try to fight the machine using machine tactics. They were trying to do the right thing, the honorable thing, but they were fighting against a group who did not feel compelled to fight by the same rules. Until now, Bill White hadn't been especially vocal. He'd said that the machine was never going to let them win, but he'd never been asked to speak at any of the rallies. Now he didn't wait to be asked. He just did. He challenged them for not standing up at home for their rights that they'd been fighting for overseas, for allowing their family members to live in fear, and now they couldn't even freely vote in an election. And then he challenged them by telling them that they would lose unless they fought the only way the machine understood. They had to fight fire with fire, and they owed the people who bravely cast their votes under the threats and intimidation tactics that the machine was using, those who did so because they believed in the men they were voting for. And those GIs had promised them that it would be an honest election. Now it was up to these men to ensure that it was. And then he told them to get out of there and get something to shoot with and get back as fast as they could. Some of the men came back with shotguns, hunting rifles, pistols. One even had a German Mauser that had been carried home as a war souvenir. They realized this wasn't sufficient for the task ahead. They needed more real firepower and ammo. And there was one place in McMinn County. They knew they could find it. The National Guard Armory. In 1946, the jail was on White Street. That building was torn down years ago, and where it was located is now a parking lot. The GIs gathered behind the post office, today Reese Hall, on what would become known as Veterans Hill. A boarding house, today a private residence, stood on the hill directly opposite the jail. It was approximately the same height as the second story of the jail. The veterans made their way along each side of the boarding house and took positions along the embankment. Menace Wilburn's wife sent their son Kenny to go find out what was preventing his dad from coming home. He walked down White Street unaware of what was about to happen. At about this point, someone from the GI side yelled out for those in the jail to bring the ballot boxes outside, and there wouldn't be any trouble. Those in the jail refused. Kenny ran inside, and Menace told him to lie on the floor. Bill White racked the bolt on his rifle. The deputies heard it and scrambled for cover. Chuck Redfern was live in his radio studio across from the courthouse. As he spoke, the rattle of gunfire carried across the town of Athens and across the airwaves on WLAR. The men fired in volleys and knocked the windows out of the jail. Those inside returned fire. White shot out the lights that were providing illumination for those inside the jail. It was clear that the veterans had military training and wartime experience. They spaced themselves. They stayed low. They shot from cover. They fired carefully aimed shots. But they weren't going to be able to take the position with just rifle fire. The jail was able to protect those inside under those circumstances. They needed explosives. By this time, about 4 hours into the siege, many in the public had figured out where they could watch the battle safely. Others listened to Chuck Redfern's play-by-play on the radio and stayed hunkered down in their houses. In Sweetwater, deputies from Polk County had traveled up to Monroe County to find Knox Henry. He decided to hide out pending the results of the election, but somehow they'd gotten an idea of where he was, and they decided that if he weren't alive to win, Cantrell would win the election by default. Henry was warned of the intent of the Polk County deputies in an anonymous phone call, but the out-of-county deputies had started drawing attention as they arrived in town, and armed men started to respond to this outrage in their town. The deputies decided that maybe it was time to leave. Meanwhile, back in Athens, GI Ken Mashburn returned to Veterans Hill with a difference maker. He had a wooden case of dynamite. An ultimatum was given to those in the jail: 15 minutes to surrender or the GIs would start dynamiting the jail. First one stick, and then another, and then the GIs began bundling sticks of dynamite together and throwing them. At just before 3 a.m. on August the 2nd, the GIs threw a bundle of 5 sticks of dynamite onto the front porch of the jail. The GIs fired one last volley at the jail. Those inside the jail were warned that the next bundle would be through the window. The men inside the jail called out that they would surrender if the GIs would stop shooting. One by one, the deputies walked out. Paul Cantrell had managed to slip out to the nearby Quisenberry Funeral Home. Because both Cantrell and the owner of the funeral home were Masons, Marcus Quisenberry felt obligated to provide an escape for Cantrell and spirited him out of town in the back of his hearse. And Pat Mansfield had escaped in an episode reminiscent of the Keystone Cops. During the battle, an ambulance sped up to the jail. The veterans, presuming that it was to get someone who was wounded, instead saw Mansfield run and jump into the back of the ambulance, which then sped away. After the surrender, many of the veterans and many of the citizens were bent on revenge. Someone tried to cut Menace Wilburn's throat, and he'd been saved by both a dull knife and his brother-in-law, Paul Weeks, ironically one of the veterans who got him to the hospital quickly, mostly because he didn't want to have to listen to his sister's complaints for allowing Wilburn to be killed. Wendy Wise, the one who shot Tom Gillespie and had threatened to shoot the GI poll watchers, was seriously beaten. Ralph Dugan, attorney for the GI Executive Committee, stood on top of a car and pleaded with the crowd to take the high road, not to become what they have defeated. He warned them that the National Guard is on the way and that they want the Guard to see that they've restored order, not that they're engaged in rioting. Fortunately, he was heeded, even though the Guard would never arrive. Subsequently, for the precincts where the ballot box chain of custody was broken, the votes were altogether disallowed. In the precincts that remained, including in Paul Cantrell's hometown of Etowah, the GI slate of candidates won in a landslide by close to a 2-to-1 margin overall, although the sheriff's race was closer in Etowah than elsewhere. Cantrell conceded through his brother. Mansfield also conceded, but he also refused even to return to McMinn County to complete his term, instead yielding to Knox Henry to take office immediately. Bill White became one of his deputies. The comparison I made at the beginning of the episode to the Civil War is appropriate, I think, on a number of levels. In a manner of speaking, the Battle of Athens was something of a civil war on a county scale rather than a national scale. And like in the Civil War our nation fought in the 1860s, you have family member against family member. Paul Weeks and Menace Wilburn, for example. In Athens today, I'm told that some in the town, even now, there are those who staunchly defend Paul Cantrell and his legacy, especially among his own family, and you would expect this. And of course, the descendants of the GIs are also protective of the legacy of their fathers and grandfathers. The important thing is that this happens peaceably now. In 1946, because of the strength of the machine and its state and even federal influence, extraordinary measures were required to return things to order, and those didn't set well for some folks for a time. But reforms across the state ultimately were driven by what happened in Athens. In the early 1950s, constitutional amendments were made to the Tennessee Constitution that hadn't been changed since it was written in 1870. It would be nice to say that after the GIs won, everything became rosy and everyone lived happily ever after. It would be nice to say that, but it wouldn't be true. In some cases, the GIs didn't stay in office very long before they were voted out. But when they were voted out, they left office. No attempts to subvert the election results. But one of the interesting things is that maybe this shows the validity and necessity of the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. In 1946, in McMinn County, the state was not one of freedom, and what was being secured was, well, tyranny. And that ended through the use of arms by the veterans. Was it illegal? Of course. But as one of the GIs said, did we break the law? Yes. So did George Washington. Or, as Bill White said, fight fire with fire. And that's going to do it for this week's episode, Taken Back a Town. I hope you've enjoyed this little journey over in Athens this week. And just as a reminder, the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Athens is on August 1st of this year, 2026. Next week, we'll be back on the road and driving across Tennessee again. And this time, we're headed to Blount County. I hope you'll join us then. Until then, I'm Big John Summers, the Tennessee history nerd, and I am history. Before we close things up, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the sources behind this episode. The principal source for much of this story was Chris DeRose's The Fighting Bunch, The Battle of Athens, and how World War II veterans won the only successful armed rebellion since the Revolution. DeRose's work draws from court records, government investigations, oral histories, private papers, contemporary newspaper accounts, and interviews with the families of those involved in the Battle of Athens. His research provided the backbone for much of the narrative presented in this episode. I also relied heavily on my interview with Tyler Boyd, president of the McMinn County Historical Society and county archivist. Tyler generously shared his time, his knowledge of McMinn County history, and his perspective on the Battle of Athens, helping me better understand both the events themselves and the way they continue to be remembered and interpreted in the community today. Additional information and perspective came from Loans Sieber's article, The Battle of Athens, published in American Heritage, Jennifer E. Brooks' entry on the Battle of Athens in the Tennessee Encyclopedia, Donald Janeway Jr.'s firsthand recollections published in the Appalachian Free Press, Neil Kamar's article for the Abbeville Institute, Paul Meany's article, The Battle of Athens, An Obscure American Revolution, the Tennessee Historical Commission Historical Marker, the Tennessee History for Kids Project, Don Moyer's article, Never Forget the Battle of Athens, 1946, and inflation data from the United States Department of Labor, which I used to compare the value of money in the 1930s with its modern-day equivalent. Finally, I'd like to express my sincere appreciation to all these authors, historians, archivists, researchers, and organizations who have devoted so much time and effort to preserving the history of McMinn County and the Battle of Athens. I especially want to thank Tyler Boyd and the McMinn County Historical Society for their hospitality during my visit to Athens and for so generously sharing their knowledge and insight. Without the dedication of people like these, I simply couldn't do what I do. So thank you to all of these folks for preserving these stories and making it possible for the rest of us to continue telling them. And thank all of you for listening. Hey, this is Big John Summers, and I want to thank you so much for listening to the Tennessee History Nerd. By the way, if you enjoyed this episode, I want you to know that there's a lot more content waiting for you out there. We're adding new episodes every week, and we're working our way across the whole state of Tennessee, covering stories from prehistory all the way into the 20th century. So if you like Tennessee history, there's already a catalog of stories out there for you to explore. So scroll back through those previous episodes. You might just find something you weren't expecting. And again, thanks so much for listening.